It was a cold December evening in 2016. The quiet streets of Kinver, Staffordshire were dusted with frost, and the soft hum of distant traffic barely disturbed the stillness. Inside a modest home, laughter and conversation should have filled the air. But for Natalie Connolly, 26, this night would become her last. She was a mother, a daughter, a young woman with a future full of possibility. Her life, like so many others, had its dreams, its struggles, and its ordinary joys. But in the span of a few hours, all of that would be violently stolen from her. A single night of cruelty, a betrayal of trust by the person closest to her, ended not in sleep, but in a violent death. The world would soon learn her story, not as one of a life lived, but as a cautionary tale. A case that would shock a nation, ignite debates about consent and justice, and forever change the law in the United Kingdom. This is the story of Natalie Connolly, whose death was avoidable, whose voice was silenced too soon, and whose legacy would be to fight for every woman who might otherwise face the same fate. Natalie Connolly's story begins not with notoriety, but with an ordinary life. She was a young woman of 26, living in Kinver, Staffordshire, with a daughter, family connections, and a future ahead of her. Yet on the night of 18th December 2016, her life ended violently, and in the process, her death ignited a national debate about consent, violence, and the law. On that December evening, Natalie Connolly was murdered due to a violent assault. Her partner, John Broadhurst, a wealthy property developer, would later plead guilty to manslaughter. Broadhurst's defense was unusual, controversial, and deeply unsettling to many. He claimed Natalie had consented to the violence that killed her. He framed her death as an accident within the context of rough sex, a defense that argued she willingly accepted the 40 injuries inflicted on her. But the grim truth lay in the details of her injuries. Connolly's post-mortem revealed catastrophic harm, lacerations to her vagina resulting in arterial and venous hemorrhage caused by the insertion of a bottle of carpet cleaner, bruises inflicted by Broadhurst beating her with his hand in a suede boot, a blowout fracture to her left eye socket, and extensive injuries to her breasts alongside many others. These injuries were not superficial, not minor. They were fatal. And while she lay dying, Broadhurst failed to call emergency services, leaving her to bleed to death. When the case reached the Crown Court at Birmingham in November 2018, it was not simply another tragic murder trial. It became a test of the boundaries of consent, the responsibilities of partners, and the credibility of a rough sex defense. Broadhurst was accused of murdering and causing grievous bodily harm with intent to Connolly. He said she had consented to rough sex, and claimed that after a pause during a sex game, he later found her at the bottom of the stairs and left her there while he went to bed and slept. The prosecution's case struck at the heart of his defense. Whatever had begun consensually, they argued, could not possibly have remained so as the injuries mounted. The prosecution's QC told the court in stark terms that whatever may have started willingly, there is no way that Natalie either consented or was able to consent to what John Broadhurst did to her after that, leading to her untimely, unseemly, and tragic death. But as the trial progressed, the complexities of evidence began to weigh on the prosecution. The forensic details were messy. Connolly had high levels of alcohol and drugs in her system, raising questions about how much she could or could not consent to. The case, as the prosecution admitted, was extremely unusual and very complicated. In the middle of the trial, they took a step that would shape its outcome. They accepted Broadhurst's plea to the lesser charge of manslaughter by gross negligence. This decision, the prosecution explained, was to achieve a realistic prospect of conviction. It was not murder they could confidently prove under the circumstances, but gross negligence manslaughter, a charge focused not on intent to kill, but on failure to act in the face of a duty of care. The judge, Mr. Justice Julian Knowles, held Broadhurst guilty of manslaughter by gross negligence after he pleaded guilty halfway through the trial. He sentenced Broadhurst to 3 years and 8 months in prison, a sentence that would later become one of the most criticized aspects of the case. Broadhurst's defense, that Natalie had consented to his actions, relied on what became known as the rough sex murder defense. It argued that she had agreed to the injuries he inflicted upon her during consensual sexual activity. The court accepted that some beatings by hand and boot were consensual, and it was also accepted that some injuries may have been caused accidentally by Connolly herself due to her intoxication. Yet it was clear to many observers that the sheer scale of her injuries could not be reconciled with true consent, and certainly not with the duty to call for help when she lay fatally wounded. In November 2019, Broadhurst's bid for a reduced sentence was rejected at the Court of Appeal. 3 senior judges considered the appeal, and Lord Justice Holroyd said they were unable to accept that Broadhurst's gross negligence was of brief duration, and that his appeal ignored his own role in Ms. Connolly's injuries and intoxicated state. Nevertheless, despite the rejection of his appeal, Broadhurst was released from prison after serving only 22 months, less than 2 years behind bars for the death of a young woman who had suffered over 40 injuries. The response to the case was swift and intense. To many, it was not simply about a tragic death, but about a legal loophole that allowed men to escape harsher penalties by invoking claims of consensual, rough sex. In December 2018, Fiona Mackenzie founded the campaign group We Can't Consent to This after discovering the case of Connolly. Her aim was to raise awareness of violence during sexual intercourse and to abolish the rough sex defense. Mackenzie expressed her astonishment that, despite many people disapproving of the verdict, others accepted it, somehow believing it to be a weird one-off and even blaming the victim for the riskiness of her behavior. She highlighted how such narratives shift responsibility away from the perpetrators of violence and onto those who suffer from it. Connolly's MP, Mark Garnier, alongside MP Harriet Harman, also took action. They pushed for amendments to the domestic abuse bill in England and Wales, arguing that although case law prevented a defense of consent in cases of serious injury, that was not enough. They wanted clearer statutory provisions to stop the rough sex defense from being used at all. According to them, the domestic abuse bill was essential because it would be under the noses of the Crown Prosecution Service and judges. And in July 2020, MPs voted in favor of the bill, which included a provision against the rough sex murder defense. Natalie Connolly's case had already begun to shape the future of UK law. At the time of Broadhurst's trial, the law on consent to masochism during sexual intercourse in the UK derived from the decision of R.V. Brown. That case held that a defendant cannot rely on the consent of a victim where he has caused actual or grievous bodily harm. However, in practice, prosecutors and courts still navigated these issues inconsistently. The domestic abuse bill, informed by the outrage over Connolly's death, brought the R.V. Brown case law into statute. It also introduced a Director of Public Prosecutions review in cases of domestic killing when prosecutors suggested a lesser crime of manslaughter. The bill received royal assent on 29 April 2021, becoming the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, a legislative landmark that stands as part of Natalie Connolly's legacy. This case is remembered not just for the brutality of Natalie's death, but for the legal and cultural shift it triggered. It forced the public to confront uncomfortable questions about consent, intoxication, and violence. It highlighted how easy it had been for some men to frame deadly violence as consensual sex, and how difficult it was for the justice system to respond appropriately. Natalie Connolly's death may have been one of many cases involving intimate partner violence, but it stood out because of its aftermath. It spawned campaigns, moved Parliament, and ultimately changed the law. John Broadhurst's prison term ended after only 22 months, but the consequences of the case endure, in statute, in public awareness, and in the ongoing work of campaigners determined to prevent such a defense from ever being successful again. Natalie Connolly's death was not just the end of a young woman's life. It became a turning point in British law, justice, and society's understanding of sexual violence. She trusted John Broadhurst, believing their intimacy, even when inspired by fantasies from 50 Shades of Grey, was built on mutual consent. Instead, she was left bleeding at the bottom of a staircase, her injuries ignored, her life ebbing away. For years, men had hidden behind the so-called rough sex defense, arguing that their victims had consented to violence. But Natalie's story pierced the public's conscience. It sparked campaigns, debates in Parliament, and a movement led by women who refused to let her name be forgotten. The We Can't Consent to This campaign, born from outrage at her death, became a rallying cry for justice. It forced the law to change. Today, because of Natalie Connolly, no one can stand in a courtroom and claim that a woman consented to her own fatal injuries. The Domestic Abuse Act 2021, written in part because of her case, now places her story into legal history. Natalie Connolly never lived to see the world change in her name. She never knew her story would end up in Parliament on the front pages, or become a beacon for others suffering in silence. But in death she became something larger than herself, a symbol of the fight against violence cloaked as passion, of the demand for accountability, of the right of women to survive the night. Her tragedy began with the imitation of a fantasy, but its legacy is one of reality reshaped to protect others. Natalie's name is now more than a headline. It is a reminder that consent has limits, that negligence has consequences, and that no life should ever be lost in the shadow of desire.